ప్రేమ స్వరూపులారా, విద్యార్థులారా,
Om Shri Sai Ram and welcome to InSAIde Scoop, a podcast that brings you practical servings of Swami's sweetest teachings. Joining us today are two awesome brothers. We have Brother Ragulan from Sri Lanka, who started his career in marketing and public relations, and he is currently in the startup space as an entrepreneur. In the Sri Sathya Sai International Organization, he has served in the Zone 4 Sai Young Adults Media team, and he has also served as the National Events Coordinator for Sri Lanka. We also have with us Brother Nen Chan Samuth from Cambodia. Brother Samuth is working for the Cambodian government at the Ministry of Commerce. He is also an active Sai young adult in Cambodia who leads several seva activities and is robustly involved in the spiritual and education wing of the SSSIO in Cambodia. Welcome, dear brothers. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sairam Pia, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yes, Sairam, thank you, sister. I'm pleased to have been invited to this talk today.
Thank you so much for joining us again, brothers. Our topic for today is the question, can I be both loving and tough? And I'm sure we can all think of people who are too loving, too kind, too giving, and that has often landed them in situations where they have been taken for granted, taken advantage of, and their boundaries violated. And so we tell such people to toughen up. But conversely, we can also think of people who are too tough, too uptight, too stern, and they may often come across as closed off, cold, bitter, and just difficult to be around. And with these people, it seems like they really lack love. So I want to begin our discussion today by unpacking what are the potential problems we may face if we are too loving, and conversely, what are the problems we may face if we are too tough. Bro Samuth, perhaps you can go first.
Sairam, thank you, sister. And yeah, this topic is very, I think it's very important, and many people also want to know whether we can be both loving and tough at the same time. But I feel like being loving person is good, and Swami has always wanted us to be the embodiment of love, right? And love is like, it's just like a sound which we cannot see it, but we can feel it. So again, love is about giving and forgiving, and love it should be detachment. So what are the potential problems that can be occurred when we are too loving? When we look at the word itself, too loving, something that is too much, it's not always a good thing, right? So too much love will link to attachment, I believe like that. And too much love, your service will become valueless, and people will not appreciate the sacrifice, the effort, and the energy that you have put on in serving them. And sometimes you may spoil that someone that dear to you. For example, if you are a parent, you are a mother, you express your love too much toward your children, you may spoil them sometime. And people, of course, like sister have mentioned earlier, people will take it for granted, of course, and they will continue to use you as a tool for them to achieve their desire and their needs. At the end of the day, you will be blamed by being too loving for your friends, for your children, or anyone else, because of your too loving without parameters or limitation. Another potential problem, maybe you may hurt yourself internally, and you may get frustrated when things are not going your way. And this the kind of too loving is not the right way to express love. I think these are the point that can be a potential problem when we are too loving.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, Samut. It's interesting that Swami constantly emphasizes on love, like you mentioned, but I suppose if we don't love unconditionally in the way that Swami teaches us to love, then we will encounter those problems that you have highlighted, the problem of attachment and potential frustration and hurt. So I suppose that unconditional love is what we need to seek to practice. Ragulan, what about you? What do you think are some of the potential problems of being too loving?
Thank you, Pia. I think I did reflect and agree with quite a few of the things that Samud had said. But at the same time, a question always keeps nagging at me at the back of my head. Why do we choose to be loving? And that's a question that I think I've always pondered on. Because this debate, I think, is either consciously or subconsciously going on in each of our minds as we go about with our day-to-day relationships with so many different people. For me, I think it comes down to my own intention of what I am doing. So I like to ask the question, are we loving for the sake of love? Which is, I think, something that we need to ask ourselves. Or are we expecting something in return from the other person? And for me, this thought comes purely from just fixating on this one thing that Swami has always said, which is that love needs to be unconditional. I feel like it's a very tough question to ask myself, but it's always kept a check on my expectations of others, not very successfully, but it's something that's made me ponder about how much I make my energy and emotions available to the needs of others. Yes, we do face a lot of issues. We feel like we are taken advantage of. We may feel like, that you're taken for granted, that people don't appreciate the amount of energy you put into helping others. But at the same time, is that why we should be offering or spreading love? So this is a question that I like to always ask myself. And at the end of the day, why am I doing any particular task or sadhana? So I feel like more than what are the potential problems being focused on an external perspective, I feel like I'd like to direct that a bit inwards and check myself as to what I expect, and should I be expecting such a thing if my love was truly unconditional. But again, it comes to my own question. Am I loving for the sake of love, or am I loving in expectation of something in return? I guess if we were to maybe keep a check on our expectations of people, then maybe we'd also be able to limit the problems that we perceive during the process. Not that you won't face problems. You may have the feeling that maybe you don't have enough energy to always meet someone's expectations of you. You will face problems where you feel like people do take you for granted. Those things will arise, but it's the natural course of how things happen externally. But I feel like what is more important is how you perceive it at the end of the day.
Ragulan, thank you. That was wonderful. Like you said, we need to ask ourselves, why do we choose to be loving? And are we loving for the sake of love? And asking this helps us to keep our expectations from others in check. And while we may still go through problems, even if we are loving for the sake of love, even if we are loving unconditionally, we will not perceive those problems as utterly devastating problems. Our perception will be far more liberating. Okay, that brings me to my next question. What are the potential problems of being too tough? Brother Samut?
To be tough, it's good. It's useful because everyone needs to be strong. Everyone needs to be independent, right? And being tough for yourself, for your family, for your community or country as a whole, with right reason is essential, is needed. However, being too tough, again, when we talk about something is too much, the problems start to come. And the potential problem can be, first, of course, people will start to walk away from you. When you are too strict, too tough, you tend to not accept the mistake and do not want to forgive that person, right? So consequently, you will not have more smiles around you. Love, peace, and joy rarely spread out around. And that situation, that environment, that state of communication will have no love, no understanding, and the angers and hatred start to take place, right? Toughness should be expressed in a way that improve the situation, that make the people or situation or the problem get solved or better.
Right. Thank you, brother. Raghulan, what about you? What do you think are some of the potential problems we may face if we are too tough?
I think people misunderstand what being tough is. In most instances, I only see people being either rude or disrespectful or hurtful, all in the guise of being tough with someone. And I feel like the purpose would be lost entirely. So what is this toughness that we're talking about? Why do we feel the need to be tough? And again, are we able to draw from Swami's living example itself? It's not that Swami was always loving. He was a strict parent as well, and you can tell from so many people's experiences, from students, from professors, from devotees from around the world, on how Swami's been tough with them. So, for me, I've always debated on the necessities of being tough. Why is it needed? Is love not enough? And it all depends on the situation you're in. You can be in a situation where it's in your relationship. You can be in a situation where it's with a child or a sibling or a parent. It can be with a friend. Or it can even be in an organizational structure where you're a leader and you have to lead so many different people. And you feel like you don't have the time or the energy to always explain things lovingly because the clock is ticking and people need to step up. We'll face so many different scenarios where we're challenged on whether to be tough or to be loving. Like Samud said, it comes with its own set of problems. And we just need to understand what is our intention and are we being tough in the right spirit. So are we actually trying to help a situation, or are we trying to just vent our frustrations and just release negative energy? Why are we being tough? I think that intention is really important. I think Samud has beautifully pointed out the problems that we are going to face: isolation, loss of love, broken relationships. All of that are, I feel, repercussions that occur if you are being tough just to let go of some negative energy or frustration. But toughness is not that. I feel you don't need to be hurtful in order to be stern or determined to get something done with another person or to communicate something in an effective way. So I guess our understanding of toughness needs to change, because I feel like a lot of loose words can be spoken in the guise of being tough. Like one of the brothers in our center has always said, you can hammer a nail into a wall, but after you remove the nail, the damage is still there. No matter how much you plaster it, there's still a hole in the wall. Same way with our words. We need to always check what it is that we're saying and why we are, or what we are trying to achieve in the first place.
Thank you for that, Raghulan. It was very useful to underscore that toughness is not hurtfulness and it should not be used to justify the spreading of negative and toxic energy. But being tough in the sense of being strong, resilient, assertive, determined, like Samuth mentioned earlier, is useful and necessary in several contexts. And if a particular case requires a tough approach, we need to ensure that the recipient of our tough love understands the intentions clearly, and these intentions, I suppose, need to be embedded within a space of love. So how does one balance between being both loving and tough? Is this even possible?
I believe we can be both loving and tough. I myself trying to balance these two. Sometimes I feel like I'm too loving, and sometimes I feel like I'm too tough. But at the end of the day, I just learn from that experience, and this balance between loving and tough is a need. It is a must.
Thank you so much, Samuth. I think you're absolutely spot on that we need to strike this balance. It is a must. Raghulan, I'm going to turn now to you. Do you think one can balance being both loving and tough? And if yes, could you share any experiences where you noticed someone striking that balance, and how did it change a particular situation?
Sure, Pia. I think it was something that you said during my previous reply, that it depends on the recipient. And I think that is the point entirely, because the whole point of us being tough is to communicate, if you generalize the issue at hand. And we are trying to communicate with another person to get them to see the same point that we see. That sometimes tends to be very difficult. So because of that, we have this necessity to be tough. So I've also believed this for the longest time. I think it's happened upside down. Generally, once you've grown up, you develop yourself into being this tough character. But I think from a very young age, I was that. I was very tough. I was very rebellious. I was very argumentative. And there was one experience that changed that perception in me. And that was during Faithlift in Parthi, so 2019. And one of the aspects of the organizing was printed materials. And one of the main aspects of the printing was banners to be hung all around Prashanti Nilayam. And one of the questions came, okay, how do we find out the dimensions for this? So at that point, I stepped up and volunteered and said, okay, let me speak to someone and get this across. It's a very simple thing, and I also took it for granted, I think. And I reached out to a particular brother and got the dimensions for all of these locations and gave it across to the designing team. So I still remember it was just an effort of 10 minutes, and I thought, okay, easy peasy, it's done. A couple months later, we land in Prashanti, and I remember the car was driving through the Gopuram gate. I saw the first banner just as we entered. I was like, oh, wonderful, this looks beautiful. And go in and close to the registration block, there's another one hanging up, etc., all around Prashanti Nilayam. You see these banners, and I'm like, this looks so nice. And I remember I was feeling very excited for this whole thing to start. Couple of days later, the opening ceremony happens, and we walk into Kulwant Hall for the prep. And I had the biggest shock of my life, because for me, the banner that was most important, the one that was hanging in front of Swami's Mahasamadhi, was completely wrong. So I still remember walking into Kulwant Hall, and I just freaked out. I was like, oh God, something's gone terribly wrong, because like the central portion in front of Swami's Mahasamadhi is so wide, and the banner in comparison looked like a very tiny handkerchief on a very massive wall, and the dimensions had just been so wrong. And I was scratching my head the whole morning wondering what went wrong, and I remember deeply just regretting that moment, and I had no idea how it went wrong. And I remember telling myself, you're going to get thrashed for this left, right, and center, because such a huge issue. And it kept on going in my head. And then our daily meetings happen every evening with the committee. And I still remember dreading this topic. And then at that point, it came up, and our zone coordinator, Satya, just turned around and asked, okay, so who got the dimensions for the banner in Kulwant Hall? I'm like, oh God, here it is. And I just looked up and I was like, okay, it was me. And he's like, where did you get the dimensions? And I said, I got it from so and so. We got all the dimensions for all the banners from so and so. And then it was a very teachable moment for me from that point, because I was expecting a huge hangama. But it was so short, it was so sweet. It was just 2 questions and that's it. It was like, why did you think that this was the correct person to get this information from? Don't you think it should have been this person? Anyway, it's fine, it's done. Just let it be. There's nothing we can do about it. And the meeting just continued. 20-30 seconds. But I think by far the most teachable moment in my life. For a leader to be so detached from the situation, but to be so precise in the point that he is trying to make. It got through, it entered my head. I didn't rebel, I didn't need to argue, I didn't feel the need to defend myself because I knew what I did was wrong. But at the same time, just by being so simple yet loving, it was a very tough moment, but it was taught to me in a very beautiful way. It wasn't just about that particular situation or mistake that I made. It was an example that was set to me on how I should be as a leader going forward. Because what you are trying to do is make sure that the person who needs to learn at the end of the day learns. This is what meant the most to me, because it wasn't about measuring, are you being loving, are you being tough? It's also about understanding the person in that situation and knowing how best to get the point across. So I feel like finding that balance is a daily analysis. There is no fixed equation for this, but it depends on the people. If you as a leader know to have a balanced head to any problem or situation, it's a different approach every single time. So what is it that we are trying to achieve? Are we doing it for the best of all people concerned? And even though we are trying to be tough, is the intention at the core of it coming from a place of love? I think this is the question we need to ask every time.
Thank you so much, Raghulan. I thought that was absolutely beautiful. We need to strike this balance on a case-by-case basis. And so in different cases, the balance might, look different. So let's move on to my next question. If we tend to be too loving as a person, what are some practical tips that we can adopt to strike a balance? So how can we maintain our personal boundaries and we remain firm when required? How do we ensure that people don't violate our boundaries and we're not taken advantage of?
I think the second part of your question asks, what do we do to make sure that our boundaries are not violated and that we don't, maybe to paraphrase, that we don't feel like we're being underappreciated or overused. I'd just like to start with one thing. If you want to love others, I think first and foremost, you need to learn to love yourself. And I think this is something that is neglected all around the world today. People do not understand the importance of loving yourself first. If you don't give yourself that love and energy to begin with, you'll never have love within yourself to share with others. I think this foundation is something that's really, really important. This will help us to deal with any sort of situation in life. Because loving yourself doesn't mean loving only the good parts about yourself. It also means understanding, accepting, and loving the negative aspects of yourself. And say, at the end of the day, yes, I am an embodiment of love. I am God, but at the same time, I am a divine being who is having a human experience after all. And it's natural for us to make mistakes. But what we don't understand is that there's always a conversation we have with ourselves. A conversation that is very important. How do we treat ourselves? How do we speak to ourselves? How do we love ourselves? How do we teach ourselves the tough moments? If you're being hurtful and negative with yourself, then that's exactly how you're going to be with others. So I think the most important tip that I can give is to love yourself first. And I think the rest of it will just flow so easily. Let me just leave it at that.
Thank you for that timely reminder on self-love, Raghulan. Samuth, I want to turn to you now and ask you for some practical tips that you might suggest to those who tend to be too tough. So how can the folks who are too tough strike a balance?
We really need to observe our action consistently and daily, and we have to be aware and be calm and be patient, right? And secondly, you may have to have a knowledge, experience, and understanding about the situation, about the love that you want to serve, you want to express to someone. Because like at the end of the day, you have knowledge, and the end of knowledge is love. Another thing is you need to be positive. You don't have to pick on the mistake of someone else. You may think in the positive way. You need to be a solution maker, because when you are too tough, when you are too loving, the problem maybe can happen, the issue, difficulty can be happen, but your ways of thinking, you have to be a solution maker and be kind always. And last, I want to share with you is that the most important thing is we have to think before we act or before we talk. Think about the consequence. Think about whether it hurts someone else, whether it will keep the situation, or will it make the situation better after we react or we talk. And this will keep the too loving and too tough in balance.
Lovely, Samuth. Thank you so much for your sharing. I believe that's a wonderful note to end our discussion on for today. Dear listeners, it's now time for our prasadam pills. 1. If we tend to love with expectations and conditions, then we will soon run into the problems of attachment, frustration, and even hurt. However, if we love for the sake of love, if we practice spreading Swami's unconditional love, While we may still go through the hurdles of life, our perception of life will constantly remain grounded in Swami's love. 2. There are many circumstances that require us to be tough and firm in order to effectively handle the situation at hand. In such circumstances, we need to ensure that the recipient of our toughness is able to understand the intention behind our tough approach. This toughness must not be an excuse for releasing negativity, and it should always be embedded within a space of love. 3. If we tend to be too loving, then we need to also ensure that we are directing this love inwards to ourselves to ensure our boundaries are not violated and we don't become a doormat. Self-love is pivotal in honoring our inherent divinity. 4. If we tend to be too tough, then we need to cultivate patience and calmness. Most importantly, we need to think before we act and really have a deep awareness of the situation and the people we are communicating with. Having this deep awareness will help us strike a balance between being tough and loving according to the specific requirements of each situation. Next, on InSAIde Scoop, we explore the question of how to manage differences with our parents. Until next Friday, happy scooping!